would like to welcome our keynote, Professor Selwyn, please. With the speech, Generative AI in Higher Education, some things we need to talk about. Oh, that's curious. I mean, we need to talk about? Thank you. So please, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. And it's wonderful to be in such a great university talking about such a great topic. One of the things you always find with technology is it always surprises you. So we're having a last-minute problem with the PowerPoint slides and the fact that I use a Macintosh computer. Let's go for PowerPoint first. So as long as this all works, we should be good. That's fantastic. Well, wow, that's amazing. That's the best thing that's happened to me all week. I've learned a new thing. Well, can we give a big round of applause to the tech support? That's really good. All right, this is wonderful. I'm really, really excited. Right, excellent. It's really nice to be here. I genuinely mean that. And I'm really grateful for the invitation. And I think these are really important things to talk about. Generative AI is a really interesting topic. I've worked in education technology for 30 years. And I've had lots of different things which are going to be the next big thing. I think there's something different about generative AI. So I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. But as previous speakers and the rector said, we need to think critically, we need to think openly, and I think we need to think as a university about what it is we want to do with the technology. So when you first come across generative AI, it's admittedly a really impressive thing. The uncanny act of a computer kind of seeming to create something that a human might have created. It's a kind of a wow moment. I think everyone must have experienced that the first time they've seen ChatGPT or Claude or DALL-E. Now, of course, generative AI is not creating anything. Generative AI, like all forms of AI, is just a computational process of statistical prediction. But even as a statistical simulation of how a human might generate something, it is really impressive. We have tools now that can simulate how a human might write some text. Amazing. We have a technology software now that can simulate how a human might make an image, create audio content, lots of different things. These are all undeniably impressive things to see technology do, at least the first few times you see them. So I think this is a really big topic in all of society, but a really big topic in higher education and a great focus for a conference. So it's great to come together to think collectively about what this means for us, what this means for the higher education, what this means for teaching, our research, scholarship, and everything that we hold dear about a university as an institution. Now, some people's thoughts and enthusiasms and attention might still be caught up in the hype around generative AI, and there is a lot of hype. This is something for the Chronicle of Higher Education only a month ago, saying generative AI, everything is about to change. For students, for university administrators, everything from teaching to student mental health, student retention, financial analysts. If you take this seriously, everything we do in the university, whether you're a student, a teacher, an administrator, a librarian, everything's going to change. And we still see this hype 2.5 years after ChatGPT 4 was still released. But I think we don't have to be quite so quick to reach these sorts of conclusions. There are lots of different perspectives on generative AI, not just your own and not just my own. So over this conference, I really want us to be open to hearing different things and challenging our assumptions. Perhaps seeing this as something to argue about, to contest, to discuss, to question, to query, to push. This is not a settled area. It's not something that we have to be preparing for everything to change. So I want to be open about the way that we think about technology. I'm generally quite critical about technology, so I also want to be open to be surprised and be enthused and perhaps even change my mind a little bit. So just to start us off thinking about things, in this very brief talk, I wanted to try and take 4 different perspectives on genAI. If we're being optimistic, how might we talk about this technology and what it means for us? But also if we think a little more critically or skeptically, not cynically, but skeptically, what issues might arise about the technology coming into the university? And then it's nice to be critical, it's nice to be optimistic, but we also have to be practical. Lots of us have to actually do things. So what can we be doing for the next few months, few years? And then last of all, regardless of our stance on generative AI, what things can we do to move our thinking forward throughout the conference and then over the next few months and the next few years? So I'm going to be positive, skeptical, practical, forward-looking, backward-looking, everything for everybody. Let's go for it. So this first approach, which I'm uncomfortable with, because as I say, I'm generally a glass half empty person rather than a glass half full person. But if we're thinking optimistically about genAI, I think there are undoubtedly some really impressive use cases of how genAI might be used in the university. And many of you are here today to share the ways you've been using genAI in your practice, some cool things you've done, some proofs of concept, some use cases. There's a lot of emphasis on doing innovative things with genAI in our teaching, and that's something I think we really need to think about. And we shouldn't forget, and I'm sure this came up yesterday, that some of our students at least are doing some really innovative things themselves, educational things themselves with genAI, many of which they've worked out for themselves, they do themselves, regardless of what the university tries to get them to do. So teachers are doing some interesting things. I think students are doing some interesting things behind the scenes. And there's also lots of really interesting emerging practices in terms of university administration, for example, the bureaucracy of the university. And there's lots of interesting aspects emerging in terms of academic research, academic scholarship, academic writing, academic thinking. So I think we need to pay attention to the use cases that people are pushing forward as this indicates something new, something interesting, something surprising, something different. But what's interesting about the cool things that we can do with genAI is I think it gives us an opportunity to rethink fundamentally what we are doing in a university, what higher education is all about. And I think a lot of the excitement and fears and hype around genAI in education over the past couple of years have really been about the challenge that it presents to make us reflect on what we want the university to be. These are big questions. It's not just about turning a tool on and watching something pretty happen. What are our fundamental commitments to pedagogical commitments to our students? What are our scholarly commitments as researchers, as writers, as knowledge producers? What are our commitments to research? What are our commitments to how we think people should engage with our research and knowledge? These are all big questions, and I think genAI sort of prompts us and pushes us to think about these things. And I really want that to happen in the debates that we have around genAI. And actually, some of the panic around genAI has sort of surfaced the need to rethink and reimagine some long-standing and possibly outdated aspects of what we do in a university. And it's really interesting that things like ChatGPT have tended to prompt most discussion and panic and change around things like assessment, student assessment, how we assess what students know. And I think a lot of the discussion around student cheating or having AI-proof assessments or using generative AI in our assessments has really got us thinking about what it is we want to do when we assess. And maybe the outdated notion of getting a student to write a 3,000-word essay at the end of every course and then marking it. And it's pushing us to rethink assessment, not just in terms of students as content creators, i.e. producing the essay, but how do we assess knowledge? How do we assess skills? Are essays the best way of doing it? Are 3-hour exams and an exam? So I think it's a really interesting push to get us to rethink what we actually have been doing for a long, long time. And I think all of this is leading to a growing sense of how universities might make best use of genAI. I don't think the discussion is we're panicking, what do we do? I think universities have actually moved now from a phase of worrying about cheating, inappropriate academic integrity. The conversations have moved from the risks, I think, to the opportunities. And we're now moving into a phase where we're talking about how universities might make best use of this technology to do the things they want to do. So, for example, how can we support students, but also academics, to learn to think with AI and generative AI? So there's now emerging talk about how we can use tools like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and the rest of it in a dialogical manner, not looking to use genAI as a way of producing answers, but as a means to think through questions. And I think there are some really interesting, thoughtful uses of genAI that are being suggested now in the literature. One of the people I'm quite interested in is a guy called Mark Carrigan from Manchester University, and I definitely recommend getting his book, Generative AI for Academics. By getting, I don't mean buying necessarily, just find it wherever you can. But he talks about how we can use generative AI in a reflexive manner as an academic or a student, how we can interact with something like Claude, and he does prefer Claude, as an interlocutor to clarify and redefine our thoughts, to argue with and discuss things with, rather than using the tool as a way of outsourcing unwanted tasks. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about other ways of setting about Gen AI. And there are some really useful pieces of advice. I was reading yesterday about the 3 T's. We need to talk about Gen AI, teach about Gen AI, critical AI thinking, and try things out. Not everything's going to work. Things are not going to be perfect. Things might go wrong, but we just need to start exploring what this technology is. Now, you might be slightly worried about what it means for working in Warsaw University or in Europe. It could be worse. You could be working in California, because some higher education institutions are going full into AI. So you may have seen recently California State University, which is completely changing itself over to being an AI-driven university. So this is an extreme response. I don't think we need to be doing this. I really hope we don't do this. But on the other hand, we do need to at least start talking about the technology. So there are lots of reasons perhaps to be optimistic. You might think that this is the optimistic future of higher education. I'm slightly worried about that, but do you want this? If not, what do you want? So definitely worth talking. Perhaps Gen AI is the future. Perhaps we do need to be thinking about these. But as I said, I am a little bit more glass half empty. There are reasons, I think, to maybe think a little bit more circumspect, if not critical, about what I've just said. There are lots of issues emerging about the realities of generative AI in contrast to what's possible, in contrast to the hype. I think, just very, very briefly, a lot of the forms of Gen AI-based learning tools that we're seeing coming to market actually push us into very narrow forms of learning. So we're seeing AI chatbot tutors, for example, AI textbooks, generative AI being baked into personalized learning systems, highly individualized, highly impersonal, highly controlled. At best, the theory of learning is kind of self-regulated learning, and there's a misplaced kind of valorization and a design of a lot of these tools around self-regulated learning. And how does that fit with what we do as a university in terms of the learning that we want to encourage? And similarly, I think a lot of the teaching tools and the ways that we're seeing Gen AI baked into teaching technologies, also a very narrow version of teaching. One of the most interesting things you can do about an ed tech product is say, what's the pedagogical design behind this? And often there is no pedagogical design. Or there's some kind of assumption of a banking model of learning and teaching, or behaviorist pedagogies. Very generic, very bland, very unchallenging. I think one of the big elephants in the room as well, particularly with the Gen AI tools that we've had over the past couple of years, is that the quality of the output is good enough, reasonably good, not particularly good. Tessie McMillan-Cotton wrote in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about how generative AI has proved to be what she called a mid-technology, which I think is an American way of saying mediocre, or meh, as we might say in the UK. The stuff that gets produced is, particularly when you know the area, is average, could be better, but not fantastic. I think we do need to acknowledge that GenAI is not producing amazing text or amazing images or amazing audio or amazing chatbot recommendations in order to learn better. I'm also highly suspicious, or actually I'm doing research on this at the moment, about claims about generative AI somehow freeing teachers up, doing lots of the hard work for them, saving time, making teachers more efficient. What we see from the research around GenAI, and we've seen this from research on technology over the past 4, 5, 6, 7 decades, is AI is not making less work for teachers or easier work for teachers. It's making more work for teachers, different work for teachers. So I think we need to critically interrogate this idea that AI somehow makes us more efficient and frees us up to do amazing things. And last of all, I don't know if you've been following the kind of the broader GenAI business hype. There is a worry that the bubble is collapsing financially. There is a worry that this might be another metaverse or XR or MOOC. Lots of investment, lots of excitement, and then the finance isn't there and the technology slowly deflates. Outside of education, the commercialization of GenAI tools seems to be faltering. So companies like OpenAI are burning billions of dollars to give you free access to their products, but finding it really difficult to monetize the products, getting people to actually pay to use the technology. And we're seeing now, in terms of actually paying for the products, there are very few corporate customers for OpenAI tool, for example. Business, corporate, law firms are proving reluctant to invest in these products that don't do a really great job. So in the long term, it may well be that these free products that we're currently getting excited about may no longer exist or may no longer be free, and the market for this will contract. So we need to be wary about this, I think. So these are kind of some practical reasons to be critical. I think there are some actually more higher level, abstracted concerns that we might want to think about if we're going to welcome this technology into education. First is, I think, a lot of people will say to you, we have to do this. This is necessary. Everything is changing. We need to get on the train. We can't be left behind. There's an imperative to adopt generative AI because it's the thing that everybody's doing. And we know that that's a particular set of quite questionable, technologically determinist logics that have proven not to be very helpful in the past. And also, you hear arguments that in a few years' time we'll have artificial and general intelligence and the machines will be smart. Again, highly questionable, highly speculative, and not a reason for us to be investing millions of euros into buying ChatGPT or Copilot for all our students. We need to be aware of this imperative, which I don't think is necessarily stands up. There's also a lot of talk about AI ethics, which I think is an interesting thing to think about, the morals and ethics around Gen AI. And we're seeing a lot of people talk about AI ethics or AI safety, responsible use of AI, AI fairness. All interesting. More and more you hear people talk about it, though. A lot of people are now beginning to argue perhaps the most ethical use of Gen AI is not to use it at all. There are some big issues around this which I don't think we can quickly kind of work around with an ethical framework or an ethical audit. This is technology that relies on stealing intellectual property from human creators and academics. All of our papers, all of our books have been fed into this. So when you say it's really cool, I can write something that's based on real life human writers' work that has not been paid for. This technology relies on outsourced, very low-paid labor in the global south in terms of human content moderation. Ethically, you could argue, and lots of people do argue, that it's an absolute ethical disaster and we need to avoid on ethical grounds. So I think we do need to be aware of those broader issues. A lot of people are also becoming increasingly aware that generative AI is an environmental disaster. We hear a lot of talk now about the carbon footprint, the energy concerns, the water concerns around data centers and the data center industry. We're seeing increasingly, because a lot of people have tried to kind of deny that this is happening. Oh, it's not so bad. You want to look at other industries. But when you actually look at the figures which are now coming out, it does seem that Gen AI is having a substantial and perhaps unsustainable environmental impact. If as a university you have a green policy or an environmental pledge, how does adopting generative AI at scale fit with that? I think these are things we do need to think about. There's also arguments that generative AI constitutes a form of recolonization, both in terms of how current forms of Gen AI are kind of reinforcing the hegemony of US corporate interests. And that's a discussion we might have later. Do we really want to be reliant on US tech? Would we prefer to be reliant on Chinese tech? Should we have European tech? Do we need Polish generative AI? We really need to think about that. But also colonization in terms of data colonization by corporations. Again, these are things you might, this has got nothing to do with me, I just want to do a cool thing in my classroom. But these are bigger issues that everything is connected to. And also, as I'm this is me being super critical now, I'm going to come back to be positive in a minute. Gen AI, I think, is associated with some really dubious thinking, some really dubious ideological thinking, political thinking. This technology has clear affinities, if you look at how it's being designed and developed and pushed in Silicon Valley, with libertarian, authoritarian, and some people argue fascist logics of control. And so there's a really interesting literature, which even if you think none of this applies to you, do read people like David Columbia, Tibnet Guru, Dan McQuillan. There's a literature which is trying to explain the kind of underlying philosophy and ideology behind a lot of this technology, and how this aligns with what researchers are calling TESCREAL, ideas like transhumanism, for example, accelerationisms, the singularity, effective altruism, long-termism. Do have a read of some of this, because I think these are ideas and ideologies and agendas that universities are perhaps not usually happy to align themselves with. But by using this technology, we are beginning to align ourselves with different ways of thinking about things that we may not be comfortable with. Is this something that we want to be unconditionally welcoming into our classrooms, into the way that we do things? Anyway, these are all big concerns. You may not agree with many of what I've just said, or any of what I've just said, but let's park that to one side for a moment and consider some practical things that we might want to be getting on with. Let's be practical for a second. I think, actually, I would agree with Tressie McMillan Cottom that Gen AI has limitations. To put it mildly, it's unpredictable. We all know about hallucinations. But as I say, if you're being honest, and you are trying to produce something about something you're really expert in, be it an image if you're an artist, a film if you're a filmmaker, an audio podcast if you're a podcaster, or just a piece of text about your own area of expertise, the output is often quite mediocre and requires a lot of fixing by humans. So I think we do need to be practically aware of the limited nature of what can be done with the technology and work with those limitations. I also think we need to be a little bit more circumspect about the benefits of Gen AI. At the moment, there's a huge amount of effort trying to be put into having randomized controlled trials or meta-analyses proving that Gen AI increases learning. And we're seeing papers being rushed out proving that, we had a test case in Nairobi and we had 7 classes of students and it increased gains by 3, blah, blah, blah. It's going to take a long, long time before we know what the learning benefits of generative AI are. The studies which are being done at the moment are very poorly done. You could say they're junk science. They're getting huge amounts of citations. But as John Warner says here, it's going to take us a long time to actually figure out what the cognitive, learning, pedagogical implications of this technology is. It's going to take deep thought, careful exploration, and step-by-step iteration. But as he says here at the moment, we're just got this kind of fire hose where people are saying, you have to adopt this increases learning. Let's slow down and actually think more carefully about what the benefits are around this technology. And there are some immediate challenges as well, both as institutions and individuals. If I was running an institution, which I'm not, so this has nothing to do with me at all, but there are clear privacy challenges, there are clear security challenges, from everything how we fit generative AI around GDPR regulations, for example. I'm working in Sweden at the moment, and we're seeing municipalities buy Copilot for all of their schools and then finding out that it's not GDPR compliant and having to get rid of Copilot, wasting millions and millions of euros. But also tricky questions of IP. The university does produce knowledge, it produces intellectual property, so there are kind of institutional challenges there. There's also the big challenge to ensure that the uses of AI that we enact don't increase and widen equity gaps in education. So these are things as a university we need to be worried about. And there are lots of individual challenges as well. I'm particularly interested in how AI is coming together with people's bad habits and bad practices in universities. And when lots of people were talking about student cheating, what was actually becoming quite apparent was academic cheating or taking shortcuts. We're seeing academics, particularly, I'm an academic, so I'm kind of calling myself out, cutting corners, using generative AI to write peer reviews. In Australia, we had peer reviews of our National Research Council applications that were written by generative AI. Academics using generative AI to analyse their data, to write abstracts, to write papers, sort through job applications. There are all sorts of bad use cases which are kind of going on in our schools and faculties that we need to be concerned about. Anything where anybody's assuming that the task just needs to be done quickly, it doesn't really matter, this is a bigger problem than we'd imagine. So I think we need to talk about that as well, the kind of the secret life of generative AI in academic work. And another practical problem, alongside the individual challenges, is just that this technology is developing really quickly. It's a moving target in a way. I would imagine in 2 or 3 years' time, you won't log on to a piece of software like genAI and prompt it, knowing that's what you're doing. We're seeing this technology become baked into our everyday software, our word processors, our PowerPoints, our internet search. It's just going to be there. So we're not actually going to be aware where generative AI is popping up and where it's not. So actually, this is a really good moment to have these conversations because we're a bit more aware of what we're doing. And we're also seeing, I think, generative AI change just in the way that it's kind of developing. There's an argument that it's only ever going to get better. There's a counter-argument, it's only ever going to get worse. This is as good as it gets. So there are concerns around the training data used to train large language models being increasingly polluted or poisoned by other synthetic data which is being developed by genAI, and the quality is actually diminishing. And you can kind of see this if you use genAI quite a lot in the ways that genAI is hallucinating. So perhaps it's not going to get any better and it's just going to get more mediocre. That's something to worry about. And also, as I said, things are changing quickly in terms of the industry. The industry has to make money on this. This is a massive loss leader at the moment. Lots of investment is being pushed into generative AI. I don't think it's going to last. And what we're seeing is education is being kind of framed as one of the main consumers of this. We're under huge pressure to start investing and buying genAI products. If you look at recent figures for the premium level enterprise users of OpenAI's products, 23% of OpenAI's enterprise users were from education. Business was only 11%. So education is one of the big use cases that the generative AI industry sees that it can sell to, and that's why we're really being pushed. We're easy consumers. We don't know much about technology. Oh, we'll buy that, that looks great. That's the reason OpenAI made its paid-for version of ChatGPT free to US students towards the end of their academic year. We're trying to be locked into. So I'm not saying we need to be super suspicious of the industry, but there is a pressure for us to start paying for this. And as I say, we probably maybe not want to do that quite so quickly. So you all look really depressed. Sorry, I thought this was going to be a really uplifting start to the conference. I'm not saying we need to have no joy, have no pleasure, have no surprises, but we do need to be a bit more, take a grown-up approach towards thinking about genAI. Not getting super excited about the wow factor of, oh, look, it makes a paragraph about whatever it is I wanted it to do. But I also think we don't need to be too cynical. I really want to be surprised. I really want to be open to the possibility that there might be good things here. But I think we need to decide what those good things are. So, how can we take things forward? My main argument, I think, is we don't want to get carried away with this accelerationist idea that everything's moving too quickly, we need to catch up, otherwise we'll lose face, blah, blah, blah. I think we need to realise that we have agency here, we have control. As a university, as a higher education sector, as academics, as students, as university administrators. And I think we should fight for the generative AI and the broader AI and the technology that we want. And we want to fight for the generative AI and the technology that we think is best for us and fits with the values that we believe should define public education and define the university. And I think we need to just be aware of that when we read about the reasons we should be adopting this technology at speed. I think we should recognise why we're attracted to genAI, why there is this appeal. These are really unsettled, I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, but these are really unsettled times. If you look over the past 5 years, we had COVID, we've had the rise of popularism and nationalism and Trump 2.0, climate crisis, we've got the war in Europe, we've got this, all sorts of it's a really unsettled time over the past 5 or 6 years, and people are looking for comfort, they're looking for stability. And I think the current AI hype has been amplified by everything else that's going on in the world. We want some good news. We want to think that there's a better future. And this is definitely the case in higher education as well, because although I'm sure Polish higher education is not in crisis, although I did see student protests when I walked down the street last night, these are very volatile times. These are very volatile times to be working in higher education. genAI offers a hope that things can be better. So when university teachers say that they have too much workload or they're burning out, genAI offers a nice, easy solution to that. When we hear about rising levels of student stress and declining mental health amongst students, genAI offers a solution. You can have an AI counsellor. When we worry about students becoming disengaged with their studies or unmotivated, again, genAI. So we need to be aware about this and see that this is perhaps some of the reasons that we're attracted to thinking genAI might make for a better university is to do with other problems which are much, much bigger than just genAI. And I read this quote a couple of weeks ago from Eric Salvaggio. For many, generative AI offers something else, a way of imagining a better future. Having lost all hope for a better future, we turn to the hype. So I think we need to be wary of that. And actually, all of the things I've just mentioned are much bigger structural problems that require big structural responses. They're not going to be solved by buying a genAI tool. So definitely, if we're thinking practically, we shouldn't fall for the hope. And I think we need to push back to this idea that we definitely have to adopt. We do not have to have and accept the genAI that we're currently being offered. We can look for alternatives. So I think this is one thing I'm super interested in thinking about in the future. We shouldn't get bounced into using tools that we think are a bit meh or a bit mid or a bit mediocre or problematic. Technology that we're not really comfortable with using. I think we need to talk about values and generative AI in terms of values. What sorts of higher education do we really want? And what forms of AI might actually support the forms of higher education that we want? So this means talking about things like trust, for example. So when we saw all that hype around students cheating, that was actually more of a conversation around trust. Do we trust our students? Can our students trust us? And if so, how does that influence the types of genAI practices that we're encouraging? And there's lots of other values, I think, and ideals that genAI feeds into. What do we mean by developing rigorous knowledge, rigorous skills? What are our values around critical thinking, and how does AI fit into that? What are our values around risk-taking, questioning received wisdom, developing personal sense of ethics, developing a professional sense of ethics? These are all the conversations we need to be having around the AI tools that we're being presented with. And I think we need to talk about genAI as a collective thing. At the moment, it's something that we're being encouraged to individually do or individually not do. And I think these conversations have to be collective. These conversations around generative AI and higher education have to include everybody in the university. So not just the people that think the technology is super cool and are doing amazing things with it in their own time. And not just the people that think it's completely terrible and we need to burn it in a bin fire. But everybody. A lot of people are really ambivalent about it or bored or just have had too much, they're over it. We need to involve those folk. We definitely need to involve students. These are discussions that perhaps should be led by students rather than by Gen X. I'm Gen X. Gen X is dead, I think. But we need students, baby, to be kind of leading this as well. And I think we need to think very seriously about building different forms of AI. I'm really interested in the idea, and again, this was something that I read a couple of weeks ago. Big AI companies need us, but do we need them? Higher education is a really interesting thing to think about in terms of how we think about developing technology. As I said before, do Polish universities need big US AI corporations? Or could Polish universities build AI for themselves? And I think this idea of building our own AI is super interesting. Who do you think actually invented a lot of AI? Where does a lot of AI innovation and research and development come from? It comes from the university. We have super smart people here doing really smart things in terms of developing new technology. We could develop new technology for ourselves. So I think this is really, really important to think about the capacity that the university has to be an alternative to Microsoft, Google, OpenAI. Perhaps not trying to make this for money. And I think it benefits us to be really imaginative. It benefits the university to be imaginative and innovative about generative AI. I think people working in universities are one of the few types of professionals that have the agency and perhaps a warrant to push back against some of the hype. If I was working for McKinsey or in the business sector, I wouldn't be allowed to say the things I'm saying, because that's not, universities are slightly different. We're meant to be a bit more critical. We're meant to be a bit more pushing back. And I think, as I said before, apart from the IT industry, the university is probably one of the few institutions that has the talent and the resources and the know-how to actually think differently and also build differently. So it befits us to be imaginative about generative AI, but I think it also befits us to be critical about generative AI. The university is a critical institution. And I think this criticality should start with the things that we do and the way that we talk about AI. So as I said before, I don't think we should be engaging in speculative talk about artificial general intelligence or the singularity or superintelligence or any of this stuff. For these are perhaps philosophical, interesting things to talk about at the niche, but these are not ways that we should be using to drive what it is we actually do in response to the technology. The university can definitely talk back against a lot of the hype that you see from the IT industry. So when Sam Altman says, and I will quote, "One day AI will solve physics," it's up to the university and the physicists in the university to say, what the hell does that mean? AI is going to solve physics. You hear this stuff said again and again and again, and people just say, oh, that's wonderful, isn't it amazing? A, it doesn't make any sense. B, I don't think is even possible. It doesn't even relate to what physics is. So a lot of the stuff we're hearing about GenAI is designed to attract investment. We need to talk about actually existing technology. I think that's a really important thing to think about today. Actually existing GenAI, AI that is actually feasible, is possible, both technically and socially, rather than this imagination that we're somehow going to have robot tutors on our shoulders, whispering in our ear how to learn better. And the other thing I think we need to do as a university is not get distracted by GenAI. I couldn't care less about GenAI. I'm really interested in AI. There are lots of other forms of AI that I think are much, much more significant than GenAI. The AI that sits in the background of a lot of our computing supply chains, that's baked into a lot of the computing that we use. There are lots of different things besides large language models, natural language processing, lots of technologies, everything from robotics to computer vision, cognitive systems, neural networks, all sorts of other forms of AI that I think are really, really powerful, but also really, really concerning in the way that they might change the way that universities and societies work. So I'm interested in those forms of AI as well, not just generative AI. So I think we need to be really, really specific about, when we talk about GenAI, what it is we're actually talking about, and actually be open to talking about other forms of AI as well. I've done lots of work recently on facial recognition technology and computer vision and how it's being used in universities. Nobody wants to talk about that. They want to talk about GenAI, which is super annoying, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity perhaps for the university to think more critically about AI in general. And in an immediate sense as well, I would urge us, as I said, it befits the university to be critical and act critically and think critically. We need to be a bit critical about the way that we actually use GenAI ourselves. And I would love to see everyone in this conference lead by example and pledge not to use AI in their presentations. The worst thing in the world at a conference is when someone stands up and says, I asked ChatGPT to answer this question, and then they read out something like that. It's the smartest thing in the world. You see these dreadful AI-generated images, which just look awful. And again, use a whole bunch of water and electricity and everything else. And I think students in particular are getting really switched off by all of this. So I would propose a prize for this conference for the presenter that doesn't do any of those things, doesn't use any generative AI slop in their presentations. And we can lead by example. We need to be personally responsible around our uses of genAI. And as I say, those images really annoy me. They're embarrassingly destructive and they don't look great. So, as I said, I've been doing this for 30 years now and I've seen a lot of next big things in education. Maker technologies, MOOCs, the metaverse, blockchain. Do you remember blockchain? That was going to change everything 5 years ago. Generative AI, I think, is slightly different. It feels different than all of those previous things. Not in a good way, necessarily, but it definitely feels... There's certainly a much more of a frantic nature to the past 3 years of genAI coming into our lives. And it's got everybody's attention. Everyone in the university, newspapers, the public. People that previously wouldn't have been very excited about MOOCs or blockchain are interested or at least aware of genAI. So I think it is slightly different, but I also think we need to slow down even more, perhaps, and take time to work out what genAI we want, if any. And I think one of the big questions to ask about genAI and the university is who's in control? And I think the university should be in control. Higher education should be in control. But the education, I think, the education community and the higher education community needs cultural and social frameworks to do that and to enable AI to do what we want it to do. So I think we need to, as I say, get over the hype. I mean, you had a lot of discussions recently in Poland about the university must be defended. I think genAI comes into those discussions because there is a threat there in some ways, but there's also an opportunity. It could well be an important part of higher education. But at the moment, we're in this kind of short-term frenzy. We need to be a lot more long-termist in how we see things and how we act. So I wanted to finish. I realise that some of you are absolutely hating me at the moment because you love genAI. So I wanted to stop with a couple of questions for those who would see themselves as enthusiasts about genAI. And at this conference, I did this morning, so they're not perfectly written. But at this conference, some of you are going to present some really cool things that you're doing in your classrooms, in your practice with genAI. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I want to ask you, what is it about genAI that's getting you excited? And that's a genuine question. Is it the technology itself? And I think a lot of people that are really into genAI just love tech. They're really good. It's a really fascinating thing to tinker with. Is it the technology? Is it the convenience? Is it the belief that actually this is going to change things that are wrong with the university system? Or is it just worried that this is inevitable and we need to do something? I think it's really important for us to think about our motivations. And then when you see something cool with genAI, or you present something cool about genAI, it's really interesting to think about what is it actually allowing you to do? What is new here? What is it allowing you to do that previously was not possible? Previously you couldn't do. And then the key question is, what was stopping you doing that thing previously? And again, that will get us thinking more widely about how this fits within the way the university works. And then also, is it necessary to be doing this? Universities were working perfectly well in 2021. I didn't really see too much of a problem. So I'm not sure why we need, I'm still not really sure why we need genAI, what it's allowing us to do. Is it really necessary given the costs involved? And then if it is, and you want more people to be doing this thing, and this is an important thing to think about, any technology use is really context specific. I could do a really cool thing with, I don't know, a particular technology in my classroom, and it might work really well because it's me with my tech skills, with some different resources, with a particular bunch of students, particular curriculum, particular subject area. I could say, well, you definitely need to do that in your class, and you're a physicist working in another university with another student. So stuff is really difficult to transfer and scale up. So if you have got a really cool use of genAI that you think everyone else should use, how transferable is this to other contexts and other circumstances? I think we need to think about values, and I think you need to think about what values you have as a university, as a Polish higher education sector. That's a really important discussion to have. And then this idea of, do you need to develop your own forms of genAI? I really think we need to take that seriously. And is it possible, and this is a challenge, and I'm really interested in this as well, is it possible to develop forms of generative AI that are genuinely novel? My worry is at the moment, we're using a lot of these tools to do the same crappy things that we did previously. So I can now write more emails that I didn't really want to write using ChatGPT. Students can write more essays that they didn't really want to write. What is it we can do that's different, that's genuinely different? And that's a challenge, I think, for all AI developers. I was listening to Gary Kasparov years ago talking about when he was playing against Deep Blue, the IBM AI system. And he said at one point, Deep Blue made a move that was completely unimaginable. No human would have done it, and it completely blew his mind. I would love to think that we could have AI that does that. Is there something that is completely, at the moment, unimaginable, impossible, educationally wise, that AI might be possible for? So if you are an AI developer, there's a challenge for you. Don't just give us another tool that allows teachers to write lesson plans or come up with multiple choice questions. Do something really different, something really exciting. So that's for the enthusiasts. And then for the cynics like me, the skeptics, there's a difference between skeptical and cynical. What forms of GenAI do we think are utterly, do we really think this is really dangerous, we need to get rid of it completely? And why? And I think there are possibly some aspects of GenAI that are utterly irredeemable. But also, what aspects of education do we think we need to really fight hard to protect and we think are utterly sacrosanct? I think those are discussions we need to have. What do we not want to lose? Again, is it possible to, let's be open, if we have a social justice agenda, is it possible to develop forms of GenAI that do new things, that can actually lead to a rich diversity of learning and teaching? Or is it possible to develop forms of GenAI in education that are not environmentally harmful? It might be the answer to those last three is no, but at least think through possibilities. So there's a lot to talk about, there's a lot to do. I'm sure you'll hear a lot more people being positive about GenAI and you'll all get boosted up again. And I think there is coffee as well in a minute, so that will also pep you up. But I think it's going to be a really good set of discussions that we have on all of these themes and more. And I look forward to seeing what you all come up with. So thank you very much. Yeah, I can stay for questions. Did you think I was going to run away?
Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, exceptionally, we are ahead of time. So we've got the time for discussing as we are in academia. So it's, I think that we are going to take care of that and we will have for sure a lot of questions. First of all, may I ask a first question? So I would like to ask you about the values. What are your values? What do you think what are the most important values for the universities? What we should care about especially?
Yeah, well, let's talk about research for a second, because we always talk about teaching and learning, but GenAI is coming into research, and I'm Dean of Research. So I had colleagues say to me, is it all right if I start analysing my interviews with GenAI first, because it will come up with something? I have problems with that in many different ways. First of all, in terms of the values of academic rigour, for example, but also in terms of academic imagination. I don't want to read a research paper that's just going to be replicating what other people have done previously. So my advice to that colleague was, I'm not sure that's a particularly good idea in terms of rigorous research. But we also talk about responsible research as a set of values. I mean, we can talk about research ethics. I wouldn't be putting raw interview quotes up into any training model that could be used for other, I mean, there's kind of GDPR issues. But there's things about responsible research as well, and that's about having responsibility of the people that we're doing research with, the way that we're generating. So all of those things, those are values that come up against the idea that very quickly analysing your interview data with ChatGTP, although it would save her days and days and days of time, I don't think are appropriate. So there are things like integrity, there are things like inclusion. If we're interested in values like social justice, for example, there are all sorts of values, I think, and we know these values. This is what the university's funded on. So it's really interesting to actually just think about how possibly can AI foster or help me achieve those sorts of value-driven practices, and where does it kind of curtail my ability to be value-driven. But I would certainly say things like social justice, inclusion, representation, responsibility, rigour, all of these things should be what we're involved in.
And in teaching, because also we are responsible to prepare the new generation for the future.
Yeah, we are. So here, and again, I do lots of work in schools, we are supposed to prepare the new generation for the future. That future doesn't necessarily have to be economic. and workforce related. So you could argue...
Yesterday we talked about the
Good.
Google. Yeah.
So you could argue it's not the university's role to prepare the workers of the future. That will happen from industry. Industry will actually upskill people the way they want to. That's not necessarily a popular thing to say if the rector's in the room, but that's possibly a value. We do need to prepare citizens. So in terms of preparing people that can operate in a world of AI that's so changing quickly, you know, prompt literacy is no longer really being talked about as a skill we need to develop. I think we need to think about, if we're going to talk about AI literacies, critical AI literacies. And that starts from having an awareness of what AI is, not being an expert in AI. I don't think we're going to train all of our students to be amazing coders and programmers, but it helps to have a kind of working knowledge of how a training model works, how a large language model is trained, when you use ChatGPT, how it's using probabilistic prediction in order to go. So it helps to understand the logics, so having an awareness, an understanding, sorry, but then also having an awareness then of where AI is. There's all sorts of AI going on at the moment, so it's really helpful to understand where AI is. So you understand how it is, you're aware when it's used. Having the critical skills to know how to work with the technology, I think, is really important, but also work around it, and then perhaps also work against it. So critical AI literacies might be something like that, rather than making every student sit down and learn to do prompt blah, blah, blah. It's not so instrumentalist. And I think that's taking place in schools now. It should definitely take place in universities.
Thank you. Other questions? Perhaps you want to...
Yeah. This isn't going on to 11 o'clock, is it? How are you doing for time?
No.
Thank you for the presentation. Very insightful and interesting.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I have a question. You referred to the fact that AI is not living up to the promise of decreasing academic workload. And I've read also several discussions, where does this increase of workload actually come from? But I was interested on your elaboration on this topic, that what gets replaced with what then in terms of workload?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Those of you that work in the kind of history of technology area will be aware of people like Ruth Schwartz-Cohen wrote a really interesting book called More Work for Mother. And it was how the introduction of domestic technologies like the fridge and the vacuum cleaner didn't actually lead to less work for women in the household. It kind of led to more work. And those logics, I think, are coming into how genAI is being used by academic staff. The fact you can suddenly mark 100 essays in an hour with ChatGPT tends to lead to you being asked to mark more essays. So it creates expectation of more work being done, rather than allowing you lots of free time. Even when you have lots of free time, the free time then gets filled up with other tasks. So the work is endless. And then there's all the work that we have to do around it. As you say, it's not, well, as I said, it's not perfect technology. So we're doing research at the moment about how teachers in schools are using these tools to come up with things like lesson plans or lesson resources. And they're having to do huge amounts of work, repairing, fixing, rewriting, tweaking, re-editing, sometimes completely reworking what it is that they get from a tool like ChatGPT. Because you need it to fit with your students, the people that you know, the people that you work with. You need it to fit with your curriculum. So with these large language models that are trained on all of Wikipedia's text output, all of Reddit's text output, there's very little there that's contextually relevant to a university classroom in Warsaw. So you have to do a huge amount of work to kind of make it fit, make it work. So the idea of genAI doing lots of work for teachers is actually the other way around. Teachers are doing lots of work for genAI to make it appear like it's magically producing lesson plans, quizzes, feedback, etc., etc. But the danger is that because it looks like you're doing less work, you'll either be given more work or you'll be put out of work. So if I'm a manager looking to cut costs, I'll replace you with genAI, even though it's not doing a brilliant job. So the work and the labour politics around this are really important. And the hype at the moment that it's just freeing us up to do amazing things and giving us lots of free time. I'm not sure if any of you are experiencing that. If you are, I'll be super interested why you think you're experiencing that, because most people are actually finding, unsurprisingly, just leads to different forms of work. It'd be lovely to think that we didn't have to do so much work.
Hi, Neil. This is John. I'm from the London School of Economics. I want your opinion on two things you mentioned. One is the imperative of AI, the inevitability, and the other one is the what you mentioned as genAI being a collective concern, and we should include students. I think I agree with you on all of this, but my struggle is when I see, for example, students, all of my students in my classroom, undergrad students, they're all chatting with their ChatGPT all the time. And despite everything I try, I cannot get them out of their chatbots. So in this sense, it's inevitable that as a teacher, you have to think about or work around that. So there is a sense of inevitability there, even though I don't want to engage with it. And the other thing you mentioned is, so yeah, I want to hear your opinion on that. The other thing is having students in the loop. I was in a conference when we had students presenting and giving their opinions, and they were saying, all teachers, all academics should embrace AI, should be doing, because it's amazing for us, it saves us time, it gives us summaries and etc. But when they were pressured and say, would you be okay with us using AI entirely to mark your work? They were like, oh, no, I don't agree with that. So I'm skeptical about including all students' views on that, and I think it should be guided differently. Anyway, so I want your reactions on both of these.
Yeah, no, I mean, huge things to talk about across the whole of this conference. I haven't got any answers at all. I think it's really interesting to talk with students and staff about why they do the things they do. So if students say, I can't read a book, I'm just like, why is that? Why is that an issue? So the reason that students are turning to chatbots is super interesting. What are they getting out of it? What are they actually doing? Why are they doing it? Why do they think it needs to be done? What would they be doing if they didn't have a chatbot to talk to? How else would they perhaps be doing it? And what are they losing by using a chatbot? Now, I'm not sure where those conversations would lead. It might get them to reflect on the fact that they're no longer talking to their tutors or their colleagues or their peers, and they're missing out perhaps on peer-based learning. But it might be that they think their peers are not knowledgeable enough and they want to go to the source. And then it might be a good time to have a conversation about, well, actually, ChatGPT knows bugger all about whatever it is that you teach at behavioural economics. You perhaps want to be going on discussion boards with other students that study this. So it just opens up these topics. But then it also might lead to conversations with students with, I'm actually lacking a lot of time, or the only time I get to study is at midnight and there's no one to talk to, and that opens up lots of other conversations. And I always start from the pretext that I'm just really interested why people do things. I don't think things are right or wrong. But the reasons that people have for doing it is not that the technology is wonderful, but there are other social, structural, cultural, economic reasons that they do stuff. I had a teacher that we were talking to who had written 5 chatbots because he loved making chatbots. That was the main reason he was doing it. He'd done one that cloned himself, and the students could ask Eric at any time a question about the course, and he thought this was fantastic. He'd also then cloned a colleague that had just retired because the students really liked that, and so you could ask Max other things. We kept saying, why are you doing this? This is nuts. And he said, oh, it's fantastic because the students, I know for a fact, the day before an exam, the students are on there at 3 in the morning asking questions just before the exam, and I wasn't going to be there for them. So we're saying, well, that's really interesting. Do you think we need to be encouraging students to be up at 3 in the morning before an exam? There's issues there about caring for how students work. And the technology was leading to all these other issues as well. So just having that conversation, unpacking it, and not just looking at the tech, but looking at the stuff around it, I think is super, super interesting. And you're right, when you say to some students, how should we use genAI, they say, yeah, brilliant, knock yourself out. But when you start questioning and having a conversation, rather than just asking for the immediate response, then you get to more nuanced understandings. And if those conversations are being done collectively, then people might lead to more nuanced ways of collectively deciding how they want genAI to be used and how they want you as a teacher to be using genAI. I think it was 2 weeks ago, a student at Northeastern University sued the university because she found out that one of her tutors was using ChatGPT to write the lesson materials. Her argument was, we're not paying $40,000 to you for you using ChatGPT. So there was an interesting kind of consumer logic there that perhaps we don't want to go down. But I think, yeah, long-running conversations as a group will soon move us beyond these initial knee-jerk reactions. And there's going to be not everyone's going to be happy. But if the group can decide on what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, then at least we're moving forward together. And also being open about it. One of the worries is at the moment that people are using these tools and not telling anyone else because they feel that it's a wrong thing to do, or they're guilty, or they don't want to be seen to be cheating. And students, I know for a fact, are scared stiff about being seen to cheat. And I think there are things perhaps we could do that are perhaps really useful with genAI, and we're just having more of an open conversation about it that at least move us forward. But don't make a chatbot of yourself. That does seem like to be a really bad idea.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, that was a very fascinating talk. My name is Annie and I come from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And I want to follow up on one of the points that you raised about the inevitability and how to push back against that. I totally agree, and it's actually something that I found myself in the research. The students are caught up in an inevitability, entrapment, and they find it difficult. They want to get out of, but they find it difficult to imagine differently, to think otherwise. So I wanted to ask, and perhaps that's a big question, but do you have any thoughts on how students and teachers can be supported in moving out of this inevitability entrapment and perhaps have the space to imagine otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really trite point, but that's kind of where I was coming at about not using AI images in your lectures. If you can model good practice, I always use black and white filters when I use Zoom, because I don't think you need to have the cameras on at all, because for environmental reasons and lots of other reasons. But unless people actually do different things with technology and you can see people doing different things or doing things differently, then you do get thinking that there's only one way to do stuff. So I think we can model good behaviour ourselves. We might even want to think about, is one of the values of the university having no technology at all at some points? Can this be an oasis where you just don't have to be online, you don't have to be connected, you can just be in the moment? As well as touching grass, you could touch, I don't know, paper or books or whatever it is. And that's not a Luddite or a kind of anti-tech argument, but that might be one unique selling point that the university might have, and this is where you come to actually disconnect and be more human, or anything, whatever it is. But it also could be where you come and do other forms of technology. You experience other ways of doing technology that you don't have in your everyday lives, which is also why I think it's really dangerous to ban smartphones, for example, from schools or whatever, because we need to have those technologies in order to think differently about them. So definitely all those sorts of things. And then there's lots of academic research interest now in speculative futures thinking, but futures plural. What AI futures, plural, might we imagine or anticipate? And what would it take today in order to get where we want to be? And I think the AI imaginary at the moment is quite dystopian. AI tutors, students doing personalised learning, very individualised. How might we imagine a more convivial form of AI future? Anyway.
Other questions?
Yes, Krzysztof Skonieczny, University of Warsaw. Thank you for the great talk. I was wondering, when you were talking about collective forms of deliberation, of figuring out what to do in these times. I was wondering, because we are, and as you said, we have increasing workloads as academics. So practically, theoretically, this works. University is based on deliberation, science is based on deliberation, and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that practically and institutionally, it becomes harder and harder to actually stop and think, especially in larger groups that would transcend faculties, that would transcend institutes, that would transcend groups of people who are interested in the same thing, who would gather at conferences. So my question is, first of all, do you think that there are current university practices or systems where this kind of deliberation actually works well and is feasible? And if not, what you would like to see changed?
I know of schools that have done this in ways that are quite interesting, that have decided to turn off for 3 months and reevaluate how they do technology. More difficult in the university setting. But one of the ways that I think it can be done in the university setting is focusing in on where work needs to be done. So the rector's gone now, so I can talk about him. I imagine that the university is under a lot of pressure to come up with an AI policy or a particular generative AI, whatever it is, strategy. Making that a genuinely collective democratic thing where the whole of the university is involved in thinking about what it is that the AI strategy says would be a piece of work that the university would make time for, because it has to do it anyway, has to fund it, but would actually be a much more inclusive exercise that would get people together talking about things. I think I did a little seminar yesterday and I was talking about this there, but making AI procurement or technology procurement more democratic, I think would be super important. If your university is saying it's going to buy Copilot licenses for every, that's something that you need to have a discussion about as a university. It's not something that the tech department or the business department can kind of decide on. This is something that the whole university, and making it more of those sorts of things. So the university has to have an AI policy, they have to buy new tech, make those things points of collective deliberation. And then it becomes useful for the university, so the institution supports it, but it can actually be a little bit more democratic. So why not do that? If you're going to have a policy around how students use AI, make it a real collective discussion. And as you say, what tends to happen is they'll ask 3 academics that like AI, a token student, and then the administrators will decide anyway. Let's not do that.
Thank you. Any other questions? So I don't know how to admit it, but
What have you done?
there are people listening to us on YouTube. And there's one question. So, Professor Selwyn, do you think that higher education institutions could, thanks to generative AI, open up to and accept more errors, both from artificial agents and humans?
In the short instance, no. I think we need to just work out how we do things in a kind of possible way. The AI agents hype is really interesting because people are now moving on to saying, well, AI agents are going to be better than just using ChatGPT. They'll do things for you. And if you look at what the AI agents are currently capable of, they have really hard times. If I said send an email to accept, they have very hard times doing things like that. So the idea that we're going to have AI agents that suddenly are capable of actually doing really amazing things, I'm skeptical about. So I would park that in the not already existing forms of AI. But on the other hand, there is a really interesting line of thought to be thinking about. How do we work with and alongside AI? Are we working in AI augmented environments? So I think that's a really interesting way of thinking. And what is it I can do with AI that I couldn't do previously? So in terms of actually thinking in the medium to long term, those are definitely important things to think about. But I wouldn't be investing in a bunch of AI agents that are going to certainly help, whatever it is, students or teachers do things. But thinking about AI augmented university is worth taking seriously. But again, it comes back to then values, you know. So yeah.
Of course. Thank you very much. So if you don't have any questions, we can go for the coffee break. We've got more than, we've got 1 hour for this coffee break for discussions and other questions. So, we coming back at 11:30. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.